The girl known to history as Anne Frank was born in Frankfurt on the 12th of June 1929. Her father was Otto Frank, who was born on the 12th of May 1889 in Frankfurt. After studying economics at the University of Heidelberg, Otto Frank served as a lieutenant in the Imperial German Army Reserves, seeing action at the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Cambrai. Anne Frank's mother was Edith, née Hollander, from Aachen in Germany. Edith was the daughter of a successful businessman, Abraham, in whose firm she had worked on and off after leaving school. Anne was the second child born to the Frank family. Her older sister, Margot, born 3 years earlier, took kindly to her new sister. The young family lived in Marbachweg in Frankfurt, outside the fashionable central district of the city, which had become expensive. The almost rural atmosphere of the neighborhood suited the young family well, and Edith was pleased that her children were able to enjoy the fresh air and the chance to play outside. The neighborhood was home to a variety of families and parents of differing professions, but it was a harmonious area, and close connections were soon forged between the Franks and their neighbors. After years of anti-Semitic agitation, the situation in Germany seemed to be calming down. Improvements in the economic situation and the passing of time since the defeat of Germany in the First World War had lessened the attacks made against the Jewish population by right-wing politicians, who had created a stab-in-the-back myth which held the Jews responsible for an Entente victory in 1918. In 1927, Adolf Hitler, then a fringe politician, had caused a stir with several of his speeches. Such sentiments were expressed by many Germans in private at the time, as was the case with the Franks' landlord, Otto Konitzer. The Franks' family income came from a combination of banking and the Soden Mineral Products Company, which used minerals from the Bad Soden springs as lozenges, which were then sold as health products. Family vacations were often spent at Bad Soden in western Germany, about 10 miles from Frankfurt. Anne was, from the notes in her baby book, quite a handful. Her mother noted that she cried a lot and often suffered with colic or an infantile cough. Despite waking often in the night to put Anne back to sleep, 1929 began as a good year for the Franks. Business was starting to recover, and the favorable economic situation benefited the center-liberal parties that they, along with many other German Jews, favored. This was sadly a short-lived heyday. The Wall Street crash of 1929, just 4 months after Anne was born, plunged the world into crisis. Income from the family business declined by 90%, and unemployment, unrest, and the collapse of social services in Germany followed. Many Europeans turned on an age-old scapegoat to explain their misfortunes: the Jews. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, more commonly known as the Nazi Party, jumped from a 3% share of the popular vote in 1928 to 18% in 1930. By 1932, their share would be 37%. Insulated away from the dire national situation, Anne had become a willful, headstrong toddler. She grew close to both of her parents, and her father spent a lot of time with his children, allowing them to forge a close bond that was rare for the time. He would tell Anne and Margot stories centered on 2 characters named Good Paula and Bad Paula. Anne was said to have preferred Bad Paula, who was a troublemaker. In 1930, the family had to sell the premises in which the family-run Michael Frank Bank was located, and themselves moved to the so-called Poets' Quarter on Ganghoferstrasse alongside members of the upper middle class. Their new neighborhood provided security in numbers. The family was surrounded by liberal-minded families, many of them also Jewish. But life in their new home was still set against a backdrop of increasingly polarized politics and a rising Nazi movement. Mein Kampf, first released in 1925, was republished in 1930 as a single volume, and included passages such as "No nation can rid itself of the Jews except by the sword." By the middle of 1932, the Franks' financial position had become more unsteady. Both of their income streams, from the bank and from the mineral company, had almost dried up, and letters from Otto and Edith Frank to family and friends show that they were running out of basic goods. Business at the bank collapsed altogether in 1932, when it was found that Herbert Frank, Otto Frank's younger brother, had accidentally invested in foreign securities which had been illegal in Germany since 1931. Herbert Frank was released after a short spell in detention and moved to Paris. When Otto Frank stood in on his trial to represent his brother, the case was thrown out after it was determined that Herbert had been a victim. However, the damage was done, and the bank's reputation ruined. Help came in the form of Jean-Michel Frank, a successful cousin who had helped to design the interior of the Rockefeller Center in New York, who sent money to his European family, just in time to cover their mortgage payments. Margot started school towards the end of 1932, attending the Ludwig Richter School, which was a progressive liberal establishment, open and friendly to Jews. Despite this, Frankfurt was becoming ever more greatly affected by the Nazis and their affiliated movements. National Socialist youth leagues started to appear in other parts of the city, and contact with Jews was forbidden. In the May 1932 election, the NSDAP claimed 37% of the vote, and the temporary ban which had been applied to the party's stormtroopers was lifted. The split between the left and the right in Germany had reached a fever pitch. The streets soon became a battleground between communists and National Socialists. In 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor, and his movement gained even greater traction in communities and neighborhoods across the country. Jewish families began to flee, as reports of violence against the community spread, and pressure increased on the family to move. Even if they weren't subject to outright violence, the Nazis presented a massive risk to their livelihood through their use of boycotts, which could strip the Franks of the little business they had managed to recoup since the financial crisis. Otto Frank's brother-in-law, Erich Elias, had developed a healthcare product called Opecta Gelade, which he had started to market in Holland in the 1920s. It was he who suggested the idea that the family should escape the net that was tightening around the Jewish communities in Germany by moving to the Low Countries. From April 1933, the government was purged of Jews, and many used the opportunity to leave Germany altogether. Shortly after, it was proclaimed that when the Jews write in German, they lie, causing book burnings to ignite across the country. The words of Heinrich Heine, Otto's favorite poet, "Dort wo man Bücher verbrennt, verbrennt man auch am Ende Menschen." Where they have burned books, they will end in burning human beings, were amongst those set aflame in the NSDAP's bonfires. In 1933, Otto traveled to Amsterdam to prepare for the family's move. He started to establish a business in his own name, entered into the Dutch Chamber of Commerce's record as Nederlandse Opecta Maatschappij NV, or the Dutch Opeka Joint Stock Company. The operation of the company was described formally as the production and sale of fruit products. In December 1933, the family moved to Amsterdam, joining tens of thousands of Jews who left in the same year. The family moved into a flat on Merwedeplein, a modern development in Amsterdam's old city. The Franks remained relatively close to Edith's family in Aachen, who would often come and visit them. It was reported in her baby book that Anne loved her uncle Julius and was delighted whenever he entered the room. Her parents also noted that she was becoming an inquisitive child and asked almost constant questions. Edith had tried to make the transition from Germany to Holland as painless as possible, although Anne found it hard in the first few weeks that the family were in Amsterdam. This was partly down to the fact that she had to remain at home with her mother during the day. Margot was enrolled in a school, and with no room at the kindergarten in their neighborhood, Anne longed for her friends in Frankfurt. However, a few months later, in May 1934, space opened up at the local Montessori, and Anne was enrolled there alongside another German-speaking child, Hanneli Goslar. who immediately became her best friend. A third friend, named Suzanne Lederman, joined Anne and Hennelly, forming a tight trio of friends. The family home was now 37 Merwiedeplein, the number indicating that the home was an apartment in a larger building. The Franks lived in what was the larger building on a square, which bordered a central plaza, where children would play in the evening once they had returned home from school. The river quarter of Amsterdam had become a center for Jewish émigrés, many of them from Germany, and around 1/3 of the population were Jewish by the end of the 1930s. This influx of Germans led to a cultural shift in the neighborhood. Bus conductors, shopkeepers, and newspaper boys spoke primarily in German, and some nationalist reaction was felt from Dutch communities who objected to this. The Franks had a period of adjustment to this new neighborhood too. Whilst they were Jewish, they did not practice the faith as devoutly as some of their new neighbors, such as the Lederman family. Indeed, Otto himself had not undergone a bar mitzvah. Learning the language was tricky for many German families who had moved to Amsterdam, as, although similar, adults and children alike had to learn new meanings for words they had formerly used for entirely different definitions at home. Gekocht meaning bought, rather than cooked in Dutch, for example, alongside starting new jobs, new school places, and friendship groups. Anne was soon enrolled in the local Montessori school, which matched her personality well. She loved the freedom that was afforded to her, and her teacher, Jan van Helder, nurtured the children by giving them the liberty to make their own decisions and learn in their own way. The same liberty reigned at the family home. Edith Frank encouraged her children to bring back friends and playmates for dinner, and they soon gained a reputation as a warm and hospitable family. Otto Frank remained a favorite amongst the neighborhood children. His ability to laugh, joke, and make up stories delighted the children who came to visit, and he made a point of spending as much time as he could with his children, who adored him. Edith, however, struggled with her new life in Amsterdam. She was often alone for a great part of the day and struggled to learn the language. She also missed Germany and her former home. Whereas the girls barely seemed to remember Frankfurt, she remained devoted to her children, who were her main source of enjoyment. By this time, the law in Germany had undergone a radical change, prohibiting Jews and non-Jews from marrying one another. The Jewish professionals were generally limited to serving only Jewish clients. Jews were presented as a parasitic threat to German society, and Germans who had once considered their Jewish peers as neighbors, friends, and colleagues were led to be increasingly hateful of them. Often, friends of the Franks in Germany were unable to visit. Some had family commitments, ill relatives and children, but many others were concerned at the repercussions they could face as those who openly consorted with Jews, even if they did so abroad. Still, they often exchanged gifts and wrote letters. Anne had developed a forthright, playful, and energetic disposition, often dominating the conversation in her close friendship groups, and never afraid to speak her mind. By 1938, tensions between Germany and the European Jewish community had reached a new height. The assassination of German diplomat Ernst vom Rath had created a new series of tensions which threatened wider violence. Indeed, the SA were planning to use public anger at this event as the basis for a renewed pogrom. In November 1938, Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, ordered that his forces should prepare to arrest about 20,000 to 30,000 Jews throughout the country, and to select in particular well-to-do Jews. This manifested in what was to become known as the Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass, in which many Jewish homes and businesses in Germany were raided and destroyed by Nazi thugs. Anne's uncle Walter had been arrested as part of this increased antipathy to Jews, although her parents made sure to keep talk of this away from their children. Despite the steadily increasing pressure on Jews across the continent, Anne and her sister were able to remain in their childhood worlds of school, holidays, friendship groups, and hobbies, at least for now. By all appearances, Holland was one of the safest places for Jewish refugees to flee. Jewish communities had become embedded and even respected in much of the country. And although there were now certain organizations, such as the Eiseren Chada, who engaged in anti-Semitic vandalism and violence, these were relatively isolated cases. By the 30th of January 1939, Hitler's rhetoric was pointing directly to the future genocide of Europe's Jews at the hands of the Nazis. Jews remaining in Germany had a renewed sense of urgency to leave, and Julius Hollander, Edith's brother, applied to leave Germany for America as quickly as possible. His furniture, possessions, and home all had to be abandoned and were sold off by the state as part of a legal forced auction. Even though they had moved to Amsterdam, the family was still only a few miles from a state that had made anti-Semitism a national policy. It was evident that a border fence and a few miles were insufficient comfort to Otto when it came to his concerns about keeping his family safe. Despite Adolf Hitler's decision to invade the Sudetenland, which had no significant opposition from London or Paris, many refugees remained hopeful that they were indeed now safe. Hitler claimed at the time this act was intended to liberate the Sudeten German population of the region, although this unopposed military aggression from Germany did not inspire confidence to those who had moved into a neighboring country to escape the German state. The same conversations were often held at the synagogues located around Amsterdam, which many Jewish families, such as the Franks, viewed as a community center rather than an Orthodox place of worship. The conversation reached new heights of anguish when, in September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. This was shortly followed by an ultimatum issued both by France and the UK, which, having been ignored by the German government, led to declarations of war on the 3rd of September 1939. Hitler's swift capture of Poland brought millions of Jews under the jackboot of his security forces. The SD, the state's paramilitary security service, controlled by Reinhard Heydrich, were deployed throughout this new territory to consolidate Polish Jews through action plans. The SD robbed, intimidated, and attacked Jews throughout Poland, which the Dutch press, keen to remain uninvolved, reported on only in vague terms. The invasion of Poland was a major concern for Edith and Otto Frank. Both of them would say publicly that since Holland had remained independent in the First World War, it would likely continue to do so in this new conflict. However, Hitler's careless attitude toward breaking agreements with European powers in his previous invasions gave them little hope that the same rules would be obeyed. Whether Holland was neutral or otherwise was not a question which they could determine, and the fate of the Jews who had fled there had become a lot more uncertain. These concerns tormented Edith and Otto, as well as their neighbors and friends. In private, however, they always ensured that such discussion and fear did not creep into the lives of their children, whom they attempted to shield as much as possible. Holland itself was invaded by the Nazis on the 10th of May 1940. With the events of 1939 and the widespread invasions which had taken place by the German regime, it seems obvious in retrospect that Holland would appear on the list of targets. This is not as straightforward as one might think. 29 times there had been a false alarm about a German invasion of Holland, and some had become convinced that the region was safe. The 10th of May dawned with great confusion. Dutch citizens awoke to the sound of what appeared to be a distant thunderstorm, and soon heard confused reports about troops crossing the border. Others saw aircraft in the sky, unsure of whether they were British or German. The Queen of the Netherlands soon appeared to give a speech in which she encouraged calm, which had little effect. Parents were faced with the immediate questions of the day. Should their children go to school or remain at home? Should mothers and fathers flock to stores to stock up on supplies before it was too late? Should one of the parents head off to work? Otto decided that he would go into the office, all the while stemming the great fear that must have flooded him. The sun shone bright and warm in Amsterdam. As the phone lines went dead, the people started storming shops. The air was soon punctuated by air raid sirens. At 8 p.m. a curfew was ordered and people were ushered back into their homes. In their living rooms, the thoughts of some people turned to their neighbors. Who would support the new regime once it gained power? Would anyone else flee? Decisions about what to do next, who to trust and where to run, flooded through the minds of many, all the while set against a backdrop of a continued rumble, which grew louder and louder with every hour that passed. Very few of those who tried succeeded in leaving the country. They were turned back from the border checkpoints, and many arrived at ports to find that the few ships still moored there were already full of refugees. On the 14th of May, it was announced that Holland would surrender. The army had fought bravely, but it stood no chance against the battle-hardened forces of the Third Reich. The agreement to surrender was signed the following day, and after only 5 days, the war was over. The immediate reaction from the Jewish population was a small, tentative sigh of relief. There were no pogroms, much unlike the stories which had come out of Poland. Maybe it wasn't as bad as people had been saying. Soon, however, books by Jewish authors were removed from schools, and the sight of German soldiers soon became commonplace. Anne had been scared during the invasion, but had soon calmed with the end of violence. She joined her classmates in damning the Germans. She had missed her birthday because of the invasion, and her family would not be able to holiday in Switzerland. But beyond these childish concerns, she remained largely unaffected at the immediate outset of the occupation. Otto and Edith remained privately very concerned. They knew that travel outside of the country had become almost impossible, and their fate to be determined by a new hostile state. Anne's parents decided to make the best of the situation they were now in. Indeed, things were not all lost. The family business was performing better than ever, in some part due to the German Wehrmacht itself, which was a large customer of a firm with whom Otto worked closely, although no record remains which shows any direct dealing between Otto himself and the Wehrmacht. This income allowed his firm to move office from their rental at 400 Singel to a new location on the canal, just 50 yards from the Westerkerk, the biggest and most important Protestant church in Amsterdam. Anne's letters from this time indicate that she was still very much concerned about matters unrelated to the government, such as ice skating, her friends, and school. Life for her parents also remained largely unchanged, although relatively small restrictive measures had come into place. For instance, it had become illegal to listen to international broadcasts from outside the Reich on the radio. On July 16, 1940, the Germans undertook their first action against Dutch Jews. This centered on the prohibition of Jewish religious practices, namely those related to slaughtering animals. Many Jews took little notice of the change. They were willing to become vegetarian, and given the sort of stories that people had heard from Jews in Poland, this was hardly the worst the Nazis could do. In August, it was decreed that all Jews who had emigrated to Holland since 1933 had to register with an office for resident foreigners. Otto registered the Franks as German Jews. Many began to count themselves lucky, thinking that they had escaped the worst. The next decree, issued in late October 1940, commanded that Jewish businesses be registered with a Bureau of Economic Investigation. Otto had already made provision for this, although he started to see that the pressure on Jews in Amsterdam was starting to ramp up. Despite these pressures, Otto remained a stable, committed, and reliable employer, ensuring that his workers had a steady income, and he was soon regarded with great respect by many in the community. He complied with the demands made of Jews in the Netherlands, and he handed the Bureau of Economic Investigation his details. At that stage, he owned 100% of Opekta and 20% of the firm Pectacon, of which he soon issued 80% to his non-Jewish attorney, meaning that he did not have to register it with the authorities. In February 1941, a series of strikes were called in Amsterdam in response to the ill treatment of Jewish civilians. Communist Party leaflets referred to Jews being plucked from the streets and transported to unknown locations, as well as to the intimidation of Jewish families. The subsequent appeal from the communists worked. Thousands of people in Amsterdam went on strike on the 25th of February in protest of these events. and many cafes, shops, shipyards and transport systems ground to a halt. On January the 10th, it had been announced that all Jews had to register with the government, not just those who had come to Holland as immigrants. The German occupiers registered 160,820 people, including 140,552 Jews, 14,549 half-Jews, and 5,719 quarter Jews. Another decree was issued at the start of 1941, which banned Jews from attending cinemas. This caused offense and anger from the Jewish community, but many continued to count themselves lucky that the decree was not more harmful. Anne was nonetheless greatly upset at not being able to watch movies at the theatre, which her parents remedied by setting up a projector with a bedsheet in their living room. February saw 2 raids performed by the Nazis and the NSB in the Jewish quarter of the city, killing one man after running him over with a truck and dragging him along the ground. Soon the entire quarter was cordoned off, and 100,000 Dutchmen proclaimed their support for the NSB. A further 20,000 or so proclaimed their membership of the SS divisions, which operated in Holland, and swore their oaths of loyalty to Adolf Hitler. The situation had suddenly become more desperate, and the lists the Nazis had made of Jews in Holland were used to undertake targeted attacks. On the 16th of February, it was Margot Frank's birthday, which the family celebrated more lavishly than ever. Between February the 9th and February the 11th, 1941, the so-called Cocoa Affair took place, when Jewish patrons of the Cocoa ice cream parlor, frustrated by constant menacing from the NSB, threw ammonia at a German police division who entered the store, mistaking them for regular Dutch henchmen. These events gave the regime just the opportunity they had been looking for. The government claimed that their police brigade had been attacked by a heavily armed group of insurgent Jews, and the owner of the parlor, Ernst Kahn, was executed. On the 22nd, the civil police stormed the main square of the Jewish quarter and attacked every man they saw, pulling them from their bicycles and arresting over 400 people. The Communist Party again tried to organize a general strike to protest these events, but the SS responded with violence, cracking down on any assemblies they saw. In Amsterdam, 7 were killed and 76 wounded while attending strikes. After this initial run of violence, things calmed down. The spring passed without any major incidents, although Otto Frank was subject to extortion from a member of the NSB. He later reported that the man who extorted him, Tony Ahlers, returned only once or twice more, and he paid him no more than 5 or 10 guilders. He did not tell his wife of these visits. The threat of denunciation had motivated Otto to conform to the demands made of him by these thugs, although beyond the threat, no action was brought against the family at this time. In April 1941, Otto wrote to friends he had made in America, trying all he could to secure plans for emigration there. Despite his attempt to appear calm and collected, the desperation of the situation can be seen in the tone of his letter to Nathan Strauss Jr., to whom he wrote, "I would not ask if conditions here would not force me to do all I can in time to be able to avoid worse." Otto offered to pay the passage of his family to America himself, and he implored his friend to pass his bid to the American National Refugee Service. His friend did all he could to vouch for Otto and the family, but the situation was fraught. Thousands had applied to take refuge in America, and the asylum system was suffering months of delays. This was a race against time, and one in which every week the net tightened on Jews under German occupation. Against this backdrop, Otto Frank's business was turning a great profit, boosted by the German occupiers. In June, the Germans introduced new plans to seize the assets of Jews under their control, by making them open accounts with a bank under their control, Lippmann, Rosenthal & Co., into which they had to deposit all of their cash and checks. This was a measure against emigration, as it meant the assets of Jewish people were transferred to the control of the Germans and were therefore far more difficult to access and withdraw. In May, Jews were banned from swimming pools, parks, spas, and hotels. and in August it was decreed that they had to attend different schools. In Anne's class, half of the students were Jewish. Their teacher bid them a tearful goodbye on their final day, and Anne enrolled at the Lyceum, premises which had been secured by the Yotzer Rat, or Jewish Council. Otto Frank tried to distract Anne from these changes by taking her on a trip to the countryside. When it was announced that Jews would be banned from libraries, theatres, restaurants, coffee houses, playing fields and zoos, signs appeared on park benches and the front of buildings which proclaimed that they were closed to Jews. Anne wrote to a friend that one was scared to do anything in case it was forbidden to Jews. All this time, Otto remained in close contact with Strauss and the National Refugee Service, writing now about his fears of full-fledged ghettoization of the Jews in Amsterdam. Anne's new school was quite different to the Montessori she was used to. The Lyceum was stricter, although she was able to sit next to her friend Haneli Goslar. She would later write that, "This was the school where I was to have so much fun and learn such a lot." External conditions had made for a strong school community, and teachers were especially warm and caring to their students. Parents were keen for their children to spend time with one another, and in a country so closed off to Jews, the community of Jewish families at the Lyceum was a solace. Margot Frank also took to the school and found it easier to succeed in lessons. Otto Frank noted that both of his children had come into their own and seemed happier and more at home now than ever before. In late April 1942, the SS commander in Holland ordered that all Jewish citizens sew on and wear a yellow star, on which was printed the word Yod. The decree was issued that all Jews over the age of 6 had to wear the star to be identified. If a person was found without the star affixed to their outer layer of clothing, they were liable for a heavy fine. The SS had hoped that this measure would further ostracize the Jewish community in Holland, although the reaction was far more nuanced. Many Dutch people treated those wearing stars with greater care and affection, whilst others, mainly students, sewed similar stars onto their clothing in solidarity with their Jewish neighbors. On the 12th of June 1942, Anne Frank celebrated her birthday. One of her presents was a smart notebook, an autograph book, in red and green checkered cloth. 2 days later, she entered the first passage into her new diary, writing, "The first present to greet me was you, possibly the nicest of all." Jews had been banned from using public transport a few days earlier, and so Anne and Margot walked to school that day, carrying some birthday cookies she had baked, which she intended to share with her classmates. The next couple of weeks saw Anne and Margot forced to study in preparation for their end-of-year exams, although Anne was becoming more and more distracted by boys and the writing of Sissy van Marksveld. Whilst Anne and Margot spent time with their friends on the way to and from school, their parents became ever more socially isolated. Non-Jews were not permitted to visit their Jewish friends, and adults were increasingly concerned about their safety. A nighttime curfew had been announced against Jews, and groups meeting in the evening risked arousing the suspicion of the regime. On Friday, June the 26th, the SS summoned the Jewish Council in Amsterdam to inform them that all Jews aged between 16 and 40 were to be sent in supervised contingents to work in Germany as part of a forced labor program. The council was asked how many Jews it could process and send to Germany per day. They replied between 350 and 375. Otto Frank wrote a letter to his family in Basel on the 4th of July, saying, "Don't worry, even if you don't hear too much from us." He went on to write about Anne's school grades, she had passed all of her subjects, and about what the family had planned for the summer holidays. Anne herself was delighted. She had even passed algebra, her most hated subject, and had a long summer break ahead of her. On the 5th of July, a letter arrived at the Frank household from the Central Office for Jewish Emigration. Edith Frank was disconsolate. The order for Otto to travel to Germany for his forced labor had arrived. She opened the letter and was shocked to see that it was Margot, not Otto, to whom the summons was addressed. Edith, when asked by Margot what the letter was about, told her that Otto had been summoned, but that he would not go under any circumstances. Otto was out but returned home at 5 p.m. He, like Edith, remained remarkably calm. The girls were told that, in order to protect their father, the family would be going into hiding, and that they should pack their school bags with all of the things that they needed. Otto Frank tried to think of places that the family could go. The annex at his office at 263 Prinsengracht would be usable, though it meant he would have to place a great deal of trust in his employees to keep them safe. He asked his friend, Miep Gies, if she would take responsibility for the family whilst they were in hiding, meaning that she would be responsible for sourcing food, supplies and other materials for the family. This was a massive personal risk, but Miep did not hesitate to agree. From the 5th of July, 350 Jews a day were called up for labor service in Germany. Some went into hiding, others reported for duty for fear of being persecuted. Many asked for any sort of postponement they could. Employers wrote letters proclaiming that those who had been called up were indispensable to the organization, and others pointed to their past military service or tried not to get on a deportation list to Palestine. The police became frustrated at these protests and delays and went into the Jewish quarter to forcibly arrest Jewish citizens, capturing 700 people. The first trains transporting Jews out of Holland started up at the end of the month. 3 days after the family started their life in hiding in the annex at Prinsengracht 263, Anne wrote her first entry in her diary from her new home. Anne wrote, "I can write all the names and everything openly in my diary now. Mr. Kleiman and Miep, and also Beb Foskowl, have helped us so much. We have already had rhubarb, strawberries and cherries, and I don't think we'll be bored here just yet." So much had changed in such a short period of time. Just hours before, she had been sunbathing and laughing with her friends. Now she had to stay away from windows and keep inside, confined to a small space with no idea of when she would be allowed outside again. Her friends had no idea where she was, and she was not able to tell them. From Monday, the 6th of July 1942, her term of imprisonment had started. Margot and Edith collapsed after their family moved into the annex. They found it difficult to know what to do and fell into a stupor. Anne and Otto responded to the situation by trying to make themselves as busy as possible. Unpacking their belongings, covering the windows, and making the rooms habitable were the main tasks they faced. And the two worked for hours on their new home. Trying to make her feel more at home, Otto encouraged Anne to paste pictures of her favorite celebrities on the wall next to her bed, which she did. She had photos of the British and Dutch royal families, Greta Garbo and Ginger Rogers, many of them cut out of the Dutch women's magazine Libelle. Otto was worried that the family would wallow in their situation, leading him to encourage the others to adopt a new routine. The family had to move on tiptoe for most of the day, as below their annex the warehouse workers had begun their shifts. Beb Foskowl's father had been let in on the secret of the family's whereabouts as the warehouse foreman, but none of the others knew that the Franks were living just above them. On the 13th of July 1942, 1 week after the Frank family moved in, another joined them, the Van Pels. Herman and August Van Pels, along with their son Peter, moved in with the Franks, once it was determined there would be enough room for them. They were to be joined by another, Fritz Pfeffer, from the 16th of November 1942. Every day, Anne, Margot and Peter would do their schoolwork until 12:30. The families had to live in almost complete silence. At 12:30, the warehouse workers went on their lunch break, giving the family some reprieve. They could, for a short while, make a little more noise, and even use the proper toilet downstairs, as opposed to the communal bucket, which was their only alternative. The few outside who knew of the annex, Beb, Jan Gies, Miep, Victor Kugler, now the official director of OPECTA, and Johannes Kleiman, would visit the families, bringing newspapers and any information they had gathered since the previous meeting. The visitors never stayed for more than an hour a day and had to leave in time to not be missed at their own offices. Once the warehouse workers had gone home, those in the annex could enter other parts of the office. The family would listen to the BBC and Radio Oranje for any news about advances against the Germans, and Otto would scour through the company files to see what his firm was doing, and to make sure that they were on the right track. Of her new life, Anne wrote, "If I just think of how we live here, I usually come to the conclusion that it is a paradise compared with how other Jews who are not in hiding must be living." At least 20,000 other Jews had gone into hiding in similar conditions in Holland alone, many of whom had splintered, parents entrusting their children to the care of resistance groups. Jan and Miep Gies were instrumental in keeping the Franks alive. They would procure ration cards on behalf of the family, obtain food and supplies, and operate at great personal risk to keep the family fed. In a country where food was rationed and in short supply for those living as normal, for people in hiding, the problem was exacerbated significantly. However, Jan and Miep made sure food got to the family, and Anne even wrote in her diary about gaining weight. The emotional pressure of isolation took a toll on Anne and her family. Much of this is recounted in her diary, in which several entries describe her sadness. "I can't refrain from telling you that lately I have begun to feel deserted. I am surrounded by too great a void," read one entry, with another describing how she was "feeling like a songbird who has had his wings clipped and who is hurling himself in utter darkness against the bars of his cage." From September 1942, Anne treated her diary entries like letters, addressing another person, often characters from Sissy van Markveldt's Joop ter Heul series. During the time she lived in the annex, Anne wrote a lot about her life and experiences, giving us an insight into her thoughts and feelings before her family went into hiding. Once Fritz Pfeiffer moved in November 1942, Anne had to share a bedroom with him rather than her sister Margot. Fritz was a middle-aged dentist, and the 13-year-old Anne felt her privacy was being invaded. He would share his worries about his fiancée and children with her. Conversation which Anne, already deeply depressed at her own situation, found hard to empathize with. Other family ties were strained in the annex, given the proximity of those living there. Anne found it hard to get on with her mother, who grew closer to Margot, whilst she herself found solace in her father. She would write in her diary that her father has become very tolerant, for he too sees Mummy's faults. In the original version of Anne's diary, she shrewdly identifies that her father and her mother obviously got on with one another, but that she doubted that her father returned the love her mother had for him. Anne hoped for the coming of the Allied invasion along with the rest of her family, and wrote of her belief that an invasion was imminent 12 times in her diary. The family lived out their days largely in fear. Every time fuses shorted, or there was a loud sound from outside, a jolt of fear spread through the household, and visions of being uncovered and dragged from the annex filled the minds of all present. By the autumn of 1942, the whole family were aware of what was happening to the Jews. They were not, as the government claimed, being transported back to Germany, but all the way to Poland. The Gestapo were rounding up not just young men, but children, pregnant women, and the elderly. In October 1944, Anne wrote, "These people are treated by the Gestapo without a shred of decency, being loaded into cattle trucks and sent to Westerbork, the big Jewish camp in Drenthe. Westerbork sounds terrible. If it is as bad as this in Holland, whatever will it be like in the distant and barbarous regions they are sent to? We assume that most of them are murdered. The English radio speaks of their being gassed. Perhaps that is the quickest way to die." Little by little, details about the atrocities being committed against the Jews came to the annex. The family did not have the full picture, but they were aware that if they were caught, they risked being victims in one of the most terrible episodes of mass murder in human history. Such were the risks that the family were unable to seek medical advice whenever they were ill. Any illnesses or injuries they sustained had to be dealt with on their own, and in total secrecy and silence. The family always had their bags packed for an emergency departure, and it was hard to keep believing that they would one day be liberated. Neighbors, former colleagues, friends, all of them were now threats. Anyone could give them away. If they noticed the scraping noises when the family moved furniture before they laid out their beds, if they saw a chink of light in between the curtains, if they noticed visitors to the annex coming and going. Otto Frank later learned after the war that his neighbors had in fact had their suspicions. The family also faced the risk of being identified by robbers. The warehouse contained in another part of the building was broken into several times, and meant that, even once the workers had gone home for the day, the family still faced a threat from outsiders who may have been able to identify them. Anne grew to hate Germany, and wrote in her diary that she would apply for Dutch citizenship to the Queen herself, if it meant that she could stop being German. The depression, pressure, uncertainty and isolation deeply affected Anne, her family, and all of those on the outside who had been willing to help the family. Mentioning the annex to anyone outside the core inner circle risked being discovered, and those who provided food, news and aid to the annex's inmates were racked with nerves. The importance of these helpers was brought into sharp relief when, in January 1944, Miep and Jan Gies came down with severe stomach problems, and the family went without fresh food for several days. The Franks lived a fundamentally risky existence during their time in the annex, and signs of their concealment were difficult to hide. Workers in the warehouse commented to one another about the large quantities of milk which were being delivered, leading some, like Willem van Maren and Lambert Hartog, to believe that Jews were being harbored in the building. The cleaning lady, Lena Hartog, also voiced her belief that Jews were hiding in the building. The rumor spread around the warehouse, and to those who knew about the annex, it was obvious the net was closing in fast. On the morning of the 4th of August 1944, Karl Josef Silberbauer, a Gestapo officer, accompanied by Dutch henchmen, raided 263 Prinsengracht. It was never definitively discovered who called in the secret police on the Franks. The Gestapo found the annex and those who were hidden there. The Franks were arrested and transported to Westerbork camp. After 25 months of confinement in the annex, some aspects of their new environment were a welcome change. Fresh air, daylight, the chance to see and talk to strangers, to Anne it felt like some bizarre liberation. The men, Otto Frank, Johannes Kleiman, Victor Kluger, Fritz Pfeiffer and Herman van Pels were all interrogated by the police in South Amsterdam. The family had some hope. The Allies had by this time invaded and established a firm foothold in Europe after the D-Day landings, and they surely couldn't be far from the front line. There was hope of liberation, and the belief that they may just be in time for salvation. Otto Frank recalled how Anne gazed out of the train window on the way to Westerbork, the blue sky, the green fields, and the circling skylarks. Westerbork was a transit camp, holding some 16,000 people. Conditions were, for such an establishment, relatively normal. Children were organized as part of a youth group and attended a school. The women and children in the family were separated, and Otto joined the legions of male inmates who labored from 5 in the morning every day. Anne, Margot and Edith were tasked with taking batteries apart, coughing from the ammonium chloride they inhaled as part of this work. On the 25th of August, news reached the camp that the American armies had reached Paris. Liberation was surely only days away. The news flashed around the camp in a matter of hours. On the 2nd of September, the Franks were called forward to board a train. They departed Westerbork the following day, riding in cattle cars without windows and no space for sitting down. 70 people were crammed into a single car, which had 2 buckets, one empty and one filled with water. Inside it was pitch black and hard to breathe. 3 nights passed in these conditions, after which the train ground to its last stop, Auschwitz. Those departing from the train were separated into 2 groups. After a speedy examination, the young and healthy went to the right, the infirm and elderly to the left. Each prisoner had a number tattooed on their left forearm, were stripped and all the hair on their body shaved. Degradation after degradation was meted out to the prisoners, who were forced to shower in dirty water and then handed ragged outfits. We have little information about the time Anne spent in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Women who knew her there would recall that she was quiet and that she wept when she saw children being led to the gas chambers. Other prisoners recalled that she always tried to be positive, to raise a laugh, and to try and win extra bread for her mother and sister. Edith exchanged her shoes for extra rations for her daughters and went barefoot. The Franks were housed in Women's Block 29. Margot and Anne, suffering from terrible skin conditions brought on by the dirt and muck, were soon transported to the so-called scabies block, where inmates were kept in total darkness and rats ran over their bodies as they slept. On the 28th of October, Anne and Margot were placed on another train and transferred to Bergen-Belsen. Edith was not on the train, and Anne would never see her mother again. 5 days and 5 nights were spent in cattle cars, and the sisters stepped out at Bergen-Belsen in the freezing cold. Edith Frank, her daughters gone, remained in Auschwitz and fought for her life. If her children survived, she wanted to be there to welcome them back into her arms. Over the latter weeks of 1944, she collapsed into a fever. Starving, she refused to eat the stash of food she kept safe for Anne, Margot and Otto. On the 6th of January 1945, she died. At Bergen-Belsen, Margot and Anne believed their mother to be dead, even though this had not been confirmed to them. Anne met one of her friends from home, Hanneli, in the camp, and the two would speak together either side of a barbed wire fence. Anne was herself incredibly ill. She believed her father and mother were both dead, and she confessed to Hanneli that she did not want to live any longer. Only a few days earlier, on January the 27th, Otto had been liberated from Auschwitz, assuming that his wife and children, whom he believed had all been transported to a German camp, were in better conditions than he. Hanneli's father, Hans, died on the 25th of February 1945. Hanneli didn't meet Anne at the barbed wire fence for a few days. Lying in her bunk, she cried at the loss of her father. Finding some strength, she went to the fence to meet with her friend, to talk about her loss and to hear a voice she knew and loved. Anne was not there. On April the 15th, 1945, British troops arrived at Bergen-Belsen. Anne and Margot were not found. Both had died, probably from typhus, just days before their liberators arrived. In most biographies, childhood is but a single chapter in a life full of other experiences and events. This biography, in contrast, covers only 15 years. Anne Frank remains one of the most enduring voices of the 20th century, expressing with incredible eloquence and honesty the thoughts and experiences of a young girl living through one of the blackest moments in human history. Anne's diaries were retrieved by Miep Gies and Bep Voskuil and given to Otto Frank, the family's only survivor, just after the Second World War was over. The diary has been translated into over 70 languages and has sold over 30 million copies. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, a number so large as to be almost incomprehensible. And Anne's writings gave an insight into the experiences of perhaps a dozen victims of the Nazis' reign of terror, and by doing so brings into even sharper relief the true scale and horror of the Holocaust, and the effect it had on normal people, normal families, and normal lives. Anne Frank is commemorated alongside her sister at the site of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany. What do you think of Anne Frank? Do you feel that her diaries provide us with a useful source to understand the experiences of those who suffered under the Nazi regime? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Thank you for watching People Profiles Documentaries. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notifications so you never miss an upload. If you would like to watch our videos with no adverts of any kind, listen to audio podcast versions of our videos, discuss history with other People Profiles fans, and much, much more. Go to peopleprofiles.com and become a member for as little as $2 per month. Members can also receive discounted merchandise, behind-the-scenes material, and a credit in our videos, along with much more. So, please support us in our work in return for exclusive offers at peopleprofiles.com via the link in the video description. Thank you very much for watching.